Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, here with my co-host Chris, who may have an opinion about the Mariners and their 13-game winning streak, McNulty. 14 now, great McNulty.
Thank you. Mark, I think that is an Intrazone first.
I hoped it would be.
You beat me to a sports reference.
You know, if I could just slide into home and, brush off the dust and say, I did it, that's my day today.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about the home run derby, and for those of you who don't understand sport ball, you may want to hit the skip ahead 30-second button, but, around the sport ball or baseball enthusiasts, everyone had a favorite for who they wanted in the home run derby. Like, I wanted Kyle Schwarber because he used to play for the Red Sox, and my buddy Ian had a former Dodger, Seager, who he wanted to win, and I think a lot of folks locally are hopping on the J-Rod bandwagon.
What does it mean if I'm voting for Willie Stargell?
It means that you appreciate class and excellence in any decade of baseball.
I like that last part, any decade. So, Chris, what do we got going on for our show today?
Today, we're going to talk to friend of the show, friend of the Microsoft, longstanding consultant, community member, and MVP, Todd Klindt, about the Wayback Machine, about how PowerShell got started, how he got started with PowerShell, and even more importantly, what PowerShell is. What does it do? And what does it mean for SharePoint, Exchange, Teams, Azure, and the rest?
Yes.
Quick hint, PowerShell are not electrified conches, but a powerful scripting language that you can use without being a developer to do really incredible things, either at a command line or in scripts that previously would have required a lot of manual effort.
Is it true if you hold a PowerShell up to your ear, you will hear the sounds of the cloud?
Yes.
So on today's episode, you are going to hear, like that Wayback Machine that is cranking, plus the Today Machine, the how and the why of PowerShell, how it evolved, some of the recent extensions for admins to help automate the server and service management, and like the concise and aptly named SharePoint Online Management Shell, yes, that module for SharePoint in the cloud, and of course the powerful, all-powerful PnP PowerShell examples. There's a lot that we're going to cover. We're going to pitch a ton to our friend Todd, and he is the expert that we want to learn about all things PowerShell. But before we go there, I want to ask you, Chris, do you know about this thing called the Monad Manifesto?
No. I am familiar with the Matheny Manifesto, which is an article written by a member of the St. Louis Cardinals 15 years ago about baseball. The Monad Manifesto it sounds like some revolutionary form of government from the 1840s.
It does. Well, it's a little bit later than that. Let's think in terms of August 8th, 2002, on the ethereal PowerShell pitcher's mound, if we're using these references still. Imagine Jeffrey Snover. He's got the ball behind his back. He's going to do some trickery, and he's going to throw it down into his catcher's mitt. Will they hit it? I doubt it, because PowerShell is too powerful. But the Monad Manifesto is what Jeffrey Snover wrote back in the day when they were looking at how can admins better automate what they do. And he really pitched it as the benefits between a command line interface and the additive use and interaction with a graphical user interface. I think that was some of the interplay between is it this versus that? It really was both. But a lot of what we know today with PowerShell is it as a command line interface. And I imagine you know a lot more about actually using PowerShell than me.
I don't know. I'm not saying that, but I've written and used a decent amount of PowerShell over my career. That's for a very practical reason. When Microsoft creates new capabilities, in many cases, we want to get it in people's hands first. And that may mean we don't have all of the plumbing and fancy configuration screen set up. Kind of the minimum viable way to release that is by you can configure something and turn it on using a PowerShell command line or a commandlet. And so we provide guidance. It's not a matter you need to invent this code for yourself. Like to turn this on, type this command, the name of your tenant, and -activate or something like that. And that will let you experience things more rapidly without having to turn them on. That's something, and wait for Microsoft to give you an admin UI on top of it. So that's been, a lot of what my experience is. Also, like in the days when I was doing a lot more with virtual machines, one thing that may not be as well understood is that PowerShell lets you run something on a machine. And it can be a command line, or it can be something that opens up a script that may even have elements of a user interface. But you can also connect remotely to run a script on a different machine. And there's security that is tied to that, because you don't necessarily want to allow anyone to run any script in any machine. But when you need to work with a machine where you can't just walk up to it and type things, and that happens a lot in the cloud with VMs, being able to remotely script things is also, really helpful. So a little bit about what PowerShell is. What have you done with PowerShell, Mark?
To be honest, I was just going to say I have balanced by doing a little bit of PowerShell through what is now called the SharePoint Online Management Shell. Back in the day, it was really for me to help promote and demo some of the admin capabilities, run this PowerShell script, and you can do that. But a lot of it was just loading up the module and going through some pretty simple commandlets so that you could log in, update a site name, site storage limit, the permissions. You can easily navigate, and then to show how you could do that across multiple sites. Did I learn PowerShell and how to really code the script? I would say no. But the thing that I kind of liked about at least learning a little bit that I did was the knowledge that there are some scripts out there that will make my life easier if I'm an admin, and I can learn them or literally copy paste them and do what I need to do with them. And like you said, sometimes it's a point in time. I'll need a PowerShell script until it's in the admin UI. But the other balance of it that I like, and I think I'm a pretty decent representation of this, is there are things that I won't know how to do, or I would need to leverage, the help of somebody else. But the balance of I'm just doing a simple operation and it is now available to me without PowerShell, that's the balance of the graphical user interface. I go to the admin center, I check a box, and I click go. And it is kind of the same if I wanted to do that until I need to do it 10 times every Friday. And that's where, the balance of a command line interface with a really good and well-written script comes into play. But I like having both. And I think Jeffrey was right in the early days, back in 2002. We're not trying to rip and replace. It's trying to give people tools that they need, either based on their skill set or the action they're trying to take advantage of.
We could explore the deep history of monads, their close relationship to the philosophy of Leibniz and the rest, but we're not going to do that today. What do you say we take a time out and bring Todd in here to talk to us about PowerShell?
So you've heard us talk a little bit about what this PowerShell thing is, where it came from. We're going to continue this 101 PowerShell, get a little deeper with a PowerShell expert. Todd Klindt, knock, knock. Are you there? Welcome to the Intrazone.
I am. So who's there? Do you have a knock, knock joke ready for me, Mark?
I hope. You tell me who's there.
Interrupting cow.
Moo! Moo! There we go. All right. So we are out in the pasture chewing cud and grass with Todd Klindt. That's awesome. So
are we just going to just embrace every Iowa cliche there is?
Bring it. I was talking to one of my coworkers this morning, and she lives in Florida, and she's like, Todd, you and I got something in common. We live in places that people just like to make fun of. And I'm like, I'll take it. Any attention is good attention. I'll take it.
Oh, I don't like to make fun of Iowa. I love Iowa. I've got family there, and it's the best corn in the world. And,
yep.
And you all are crazy enough to actually turn Field of Dreams from a movie into an actual major league ballpark. So
yeah, but I embrace it. I own it. I've lived in Iowa my whole life, so I can take it. I'm tough.
So, Todd, I have two questions for you as we kick off here. Now that we know you're from Iowa, we want to know a little bit more about you so people can understand the credibility you're bringing to this episode. And the part two of the question is going to really land, do you have cred or not? So let's start with, who is Todd? What are you in your work world, or anything that flavors our audience to know more about you?
Yeah, well, so I've been a professional computer nerd for my whole career, for 25 years or whatever it is I've been doing this. I can say that being a nerd now is a lot cooler than it was when I was in school. I've been a kind of a nerd my whole life. And so that's part of the credit. I've got a lot of experience at this. I've been doing SharePoint for a real job for like 20 years. I have been a SharePoint admin, which we're going to bring that into PowerShell. A SharePoint admin since the very first version of SharePoint Team Services 2001. I ran a production farm with that, and I've done it ever since. I've written a bunch of books back in the day when people wrote tech books. I did that. You can go out to Amazon and buy them. They're very cheap now because, the tech is old. I've been on stage at many Microsoft conferences, things like that. I've been all over the world spreading the joy about Microsoft. I've been a Microsoft MVP since 2005, 2006, something like that. I forget exactly when that honor was first bestowed upon me. And I like the tech. I'm a pretty friendly guy. I like talking about it. And so that's why I love doing things like this and, blogging and all that kind of stuff.
So we're landing the plane on your credibility, and in fact, I think I'm gonna buy a book so that next time I see you, I want to see your signature all over some pre-2010 something. I that's what I'm gonna get. But to really land this plane, to very much use a recent Top Gun visual, CFUR, Top Gun, SharePoint PowerShell. You have a website, toddklindt.com. Go there now, everybody listening. And I want to know, and I want our audience to know, what version of SharePoint is running your homepage and your blog. I'm just going to be quiet now.
Yeah, so that comes up a lot, especially among my coworkers at Sympraxis. I will say that the platform my blog is running on is universally recognized as probably the best public blogging platform ever. I kind of feel like civilization peaked when that platform was released. My blog is on SharePoint 2010. Fresh. It's fresh now as it was, 13 years ago when it was released. Yeah,
I love it. toddklindt.com, and you should just breathe in and inhale what we would refer to as classic SharePoint.
Yep, the good old days.
Todd, I remember back in, the earliest days of the SharePoint community when, some of your sessions started pivoting away from kind of pure admin towards PowerShell. And I always found them not just entertaining, but really informational. I'd love to kind of get your perspective on, first and foremost, what is PowerShell?
PowerShell, I think like the technical description for it would be a command line interface tool that is object-oriented or object-driven, I think would probably be the best way. Now, to your audience that hasn't spent much time with PowerShell, the command line interface bit is probably pretty obvious. It's looks like the old CMD, or if they come from the Unix world, it looks like a bash shell or a C shell or something.
It looks like your blog, is what you're saying.
Yes, it's nearly as old as my blog. But the object-oriented bit is really where all of the power and the tasty flavor of PowerShell comes from. And that is that when you run anything in PowerShell, you don't get splatterings of text back. You get this ball of objecty goodness that you can make decisions based on what's in that object or do actions based on that object. And that's really where the power in PowerShell comes from. And that's one of the things. So I don't know, Chris, if you ever went to any of my beginning PowerShell sessions, but that was one of the slides that I spent a lot of time on. Is I hear this thing uses objects. What the heck is an object? Because that was something as a non-developer, I had a really tough time wrapping my head around until somebody sat me down with a crayon and paper and said, "Okay, Todd, we're not leaving this table until you can tell me what an object is."
Yeah, I remember coming down the hall to one of your sessions. Largely because, and I'm going to start to date myself, I wrote what may be the world's longest Windows script ever that we were using when I was at John Hancock to document every single PC in the organization. It was like nightly polling and capturing all of this stuff. And I was trying to figure out a better way to adapt it into PowerShell. I do have a tiny bit of a dev background, but it's PowerShell can be great for these mega impactful orchestrations, but it's also such a great utility knife. Just when you just need to be able to do one thing and have a tiny bit of power that you can just plug it in right away.
And so for your audience, again, as we talk about objects, the best description, and I stole this from somebody and I wish I could remember who, but since I can't, I'll just have to take credit for it. The slide that I would have up is I would have the picture of my two cars. And I would say, a car is an object. And these two things are an instance of the object car. And so when I start talking about my car, even if you've never seen it, when you hear the word car, you know some things about the object I'm talking about. It's got wheels and it's got doors and things like that. And then each instance of that object has its own values for those properties. One of my cars has 4 doors and one of my car has 2 doors and one of my cars is blue and one of my cars is black. And that is part of an object. That is the properties of an object. But then objects also have methods, and that's things that you can do to the object. So for the car object, you can start the car, you can open the trunk, you can open the passenger door, those kind of things. And those are all methods on the object type car. So it doesn't matter what kind of car you're talking about, where it is in the world, who made it, whatever. You just know that car object has those properties and those methods. And when you start thinking about PowerShell, and again, I'm a SharePoint guy, so everything looks like SharePoint. Anytime we do a get in PowerShell, get SP site, get SP web, whatever, we get an instance of that object or a collection of those objects. And as soon as we know we have an SP site object, we know it's got specific things, owners and all that kind of stuff. And once you really get your head wrapped around that, then you can start filtering by, only getting webs that have a certain template or are owned by a certain person or were created after a certain date. And it makes the automation, these big scripts that you're talking about, these big orchestration things. Once you get your head around this idea of objects, then you can really start to make some really great scripts and do it pretty easily, honestly.
So you have me thinking for my next car purchase, I may skip the dealership and just get the car straight from PowerShell, because I think that's so much nicer than going into the dealership. And do you know if PowerShell is a good haggler, or is it like just easy? It's list price and you just pay it?
You just get car price and it tells you what it costs.
Perfect. And deliver it and all that. So beyond the silly, I think we want to take the conversation a little bit to learn from you how PowerShell evolved specific to SharePoint, and certainly other examples are very welcome. I know that both PowerShell and SharePoint share the old style Camelback branding, so capital P, capital S. Same with SharePoint, capital S, capital P, just reverse them. But when you put them together, how would you bring somebody up to speed on understanding the PowerShell connection to SharePoint kind of then and now? And I think maybe now we save just a little bit to talk about the cloud, but that little evolution of PowerShell with SharePoint.
Yeah, so the first version of SharePoint that natively supported PowerShell was SharePoint 2010. So bringing it back to my blog, that's why I settled on that one. I could manage my blog with PowerShell. So all my dreams had been met. I was in good shape. So the first 3 versions of SharePoint, 2001, 2003, and 2007, didn't have PowerShell. Well, PowerShell didn't exist until somewhere in the time frame of 2007. And clever folks had written PowerShell for it. You could do this thing called reflection, and you could make some commandlets, but none of that was sanctioned by Microsoft. It was horrible business. But the SharePoint team wrote a command line tool for folks like us. So in SharePoint 2001, it was called OWS ADM, and for 2003 and 2007, it was STS ADM. And for me, again, I was a SharePoint admin then. And it's funny as I look back, so this was, the 2003, 2004, 2005 timeframe. I was running what was at the time a good-sized SharePoint farm. It had hundreds of site collections and probably thousands of webs. So it was huge by, a lot of standards. And it was also, at the time, the company I worked for wrote some software that bolted onto SharePoint. And those were dark days in adding onto SharePoint. You had to, put things in the bin and the GAC, and it was pretty horrible. And so you often had to touch every site collection when you were doing something, or touch every web. So I had to automate that because there was only a couple of us on the IT team. So I got really adept at using STS ADM, and STS ADM was written for SharePoint by the SharePoint team. So it had nothing but SharePoint in it. And I remember in the 2007 timeframe, I was trying to figure out how to do something. One of our lead developers I was walking him through, and he's like, well, why don't you write a PowerShell script? And I'm like, I don't know how. He's like, well, I'll just give you the stuff and you can put it in a PS1 file. And I'm like, I don't know what a PS1 file is. Like, how do you even make one of those things? He's like, well, you open Notepad and you paste the text in and you save it. So, I mean, I didn't even have any idea. I was thinking like a Word document or something. I didn't even know. So then the MVPs were invited, and probably NDAs probably, cleared by this statute of limitations was run out. In 2008 or 2009, the MVPs were out at Microsoft for the MVP Summit, and they were showing us the very first look at what would be SharePoint 2010. And I think Sean Livingston was the Microsoft guy who we were talking to, but he's going through all the stuff in SharePoint 2010. He's like, and we've got great news. The next version of SharePoint will be the admin interface, the command line admin interface will be all PowerShell. And I remember sitting there thinking, well, I'm not smart enough to use this. I have to get another job. I have to learn how to flip burgers or something, because I would heard all this, my developer buddies love PowerShell and the objects, whatever those were. And I was kind of resistant to it because STS-ADM had taken me a long way. The first magazine article that I ever wrote about SharePoint was on STS-ADM. The first book chapter I wrote about SharePoint was on STS-ADM. The first time Microsoft ever invited me up on the stage at TechEd was a 75-minute session on STS-ADM. I'd kind of, hitched my wagon to that horse. And now I'm hearing that the good news, that's going away, and this PowerShell thing is going to be replacing it. So I was sitting next to my sidekick, Shane Young, and him and I were looking at each other and we're like, we gotta figure out whatever this PowerShell thing is. Like, we gotta figure this out. So I remember we went back to our respective states, Iowa and Ohio. And for anybody outside of Iowa and Ohio, those are mostly interchangeable. They may even be the same place. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Ohio's always circling the block, waiting to step in for Iowa at a moment's notice, right?
Idaho, Iowa, Ohio, all those states, vowels on the end. So we were sitting on Skype and we're like, okay, we got to figure this thing out. And the beta of SharePoint 2010 had, the PowerShell snap-in built in. And we're like, all right, so one of the things we do all the time is we create a site or a site collection. Let's just do that in PowerShell. I could do this in my sleep in Central Admin. Let's do it in PowerShell. It probably took us 2 hours. It was just that foreign. And we had gone out and bought, I think it was called PowerShell in Action by Bruce Payette, who was one of the godfathers of PowerShell. And I started reading that thing, and I got about 7 pages in, and there's still like a drool mark on page 8 where I just fell asleep, because it's just not, you don't learn languages that way. That's just not a good way to do it. So finding something that I knew how to do and then figuring out how to do it in PowerShell was the way to learn. But it was painful and it took forever. But we just kind of plowed through and made it happen. And that has become, so, we're going to talk about the cloud later, but PowerShell for all the Microsoft products, and I think Exchange was the first one to really hit PowerShell with any kind of real, legitimacy, and then SharePoint was shortly thereafter. But that has just become the admin interface of choice. Like, if I have to do anything in Windows or Azure or any of that, I just do it in PowerShell. Like, I don't even think about the UI anymore. It's just become my primary way of doing things. And then normally for the things that I do as a consultant, I end up having to package it for a customer or reproduce it for a customer. As I was working on something today, I'm going to have to do this very complex, 20 or 30 step process, 180, 190 times, something like that. Because I just started out in PowerShell, it's just kind of grown out of that. But that's my weapon of choice at this point, I think.
I think it would be helpful, you've walked through some of those things that, by the way, it was, like water to thirsty people, being able to enumerate all the libraries and all the sites and all the site collections and walk through them and do things to them at scale. When you think about kind of PowerShell today, and I know you've got guru-like skills, what is something that someone who may just be interested in exploring it could be able to do inside of M365 with PowerShell that they couldn't do without using it? Just to give an example.
I will rewrite that question a little bit to fit the answer that I want to give it. But one thing that I always tell folks when I'm proselytizing PowerShell to anybody who will listen, any kind of customer call I get on, people I see at the grocery store, whatever. Anytime I get a chance to proselytize PowerShell, I do. And one of the things that I tell people is anytime anything new comes to Microsoft 365, which that the flurry of new functionality is it's mind-boggling at this time. But anytime new functionality comes to Microsoft 365, the way to turn it on and the way to control it and all the knobs and buttons and all that are going to show up in PowerShell first. And so if you want to be able to, make a hub site or, set up multi-geo or any of that kind of stuff, if you want to do that right away, you're going to have to be comfortable with PowerShell because that's where the knobs for that are going to show up first. And so, you asked what's a good reason for people to get comfortable with PowerShell? What can they do? And that's one of the things for me. Anytime something new shows up, if you're a little bit comfortable with PowerShell, you can run right in there, turn it on, turn it off, whatever, and play with it.
Yeah, and I will affirm that. Like, in product team discussions, when we have new capabilities, anytime the discussion is, should we release this now? Or should we release it in 6 months and build an end user, an admin interface for it? And we're still going to build the admin interface, but we'd rather get the capability out sooner so people can at least start working with it using PowerShell. And we know that the ultimate end state is you've got the great UX. It's got all the bells and whistles. And I guess that's for someone like Shane to work with. Sorry, I can't resist.
Yeah, that guy.
Yeah. Sorry, Shane. We love you. We love you.
We really don't. And it's practical because what I tell folks is there's really two things that run that. Number one, if you all at Microsoft put it in the interface, you have to internationalize it. And you have to make it fit someplace logical in the pages and not crowd things up. And that takes a lot of work. You all put a ton of thought into that process. But for PowerShell, you just have to give a commandlet. And Godfather Snover, Jeffrey Snover, when he birthed PowerShell and blessed the world with it, he put out a whole lot of really great rules about it. And so creating a PowerShell commandlet or function and the names for the verbs you'll use and how to format the nouns and what the parameters look like he gave us all those guardrails. And so for you all to write that PowerShell commandlet, it's really like a Mad Lib. You just kind of fill in the blanks and then you put your functionality in and you could have it out pretty quickly. So yeah, that's the best way for you all to get the functionality in our hands so we can start poking at it. And then you can put a lot of time and effort into that admin interface so that it looks great and works well when it does come out.
I just want to add one fairly recent and relevant example that for me, compared to both of you, I'm like, I shouldn't even be able to spell PowerShell. But I see, the same pattern that Chris described. And I think to the grow up nature of what you just were, kind of extrapolating on. Even with something as big a push from Microsoft as Viva Connections, a really new, modern way to get your intranet into Teams, it was a number of months where the only way you could do it was run a PowerShell script. And voila, look at that. Your intranet shows up as an app in Teams. Now there's UX for it. But I think to your point, Todd, for folks that really did want to jump on that and that it was all possible and supported and capable of doing so, it really was. And again, I think it's PowerShell. I could, at least say that to people. Oh, all you need is a simple power script, a command lit, and you got Viva Connections. So I think you both are very right, and I think it's also really important for people to know that if they want to try something early, pilot something quickly, or to, I think, really the value long term, which is really what I want to ask next is when you have something you need to do over and over again in a really programmatic way. So, but Todd, when you think of cloud, and that certainly brings us a little bit more into the modern era, not just with Viva, but with anything that touches anything to do with SharePoint, the content service on the back end, there's a flavor of PowerShell that we gave a great name to called the SharePoint Online Management Shell.
Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
It does. And it's just so easy to say it when you're demoing it and talking about it a lot and having to write it out all the time. No bias there. But do you mind just giving a little commentary on what the SharePoint Online Management Shell is, and maybe even that how does it work on top of PowerShell so that people are aware?
So again, I'm going to gush a bunch about Jeff Snover and what a great job he did with PowerShell. And for those of you who are listening, when Mark and I first started talking about doing this episode months and months and months ago, he had this great idea where he would bring Jeff on and talk about the humble beginnings of PowerShell, and then bring me in as to what PowerShell look like today, kind of the stuff we're talking about now. And Jeff was so opposed to coming on to the podcast, and I don't know if because of me or Mark, but he just retired. Like he just left the business. So
he actually did follow up, and he said that you potentially were going to reference Shane Young and your 2010 blog, and he said,
can't be any part of that.
I can't be there for that.
Fair enough.
Oh, someone called 911. Sorry, gratuitous reference.
Yes.
Ooh, that was good.
Yeah.
That was good.
So Snover and team, they gave us this great framework of PowerShell, and PowerShell is really an engine that sits, that runs on your computer. And one of the things that can use that engine is a host, which is like your PowerShell, host window that looks like CMD. It can be the ISE, it can be Visual Studio Code, whatever, but that host uses the engine. And then if you want to add more functionality to PowerShell, you can write a module. And that module is just code that drops in, and over the years, the way modules have worked has really matured greatly. But now, if you put that module, it's usually a PSM1 or PSD1 file in a place that PowerShell, the engine and the host knows about. You can just start typing commands, and it'll figure out, it'll look through it, and it'll bring it up. So that's what the SharePoint Online module or whatever that I lost track. I fell asleep partially through the name there.
That's right. More drool on some on just the name itself. You're going to drool by the seventh word.
Yep. So that is a module that you can download from the PowerShell gallery now. So there's a commandlet that you can use. Add module and type all that out. And then rest a bit and type some more, and that will load it into your shell and then onto your computer, and then you can get in and start playing with SharePoint. And I've got kind of a funny story about that too. I did a PowerShell and SharePoint server session for a conference down in Australia, and this was 8 years ago, something like that. I forget when it was. And it went over well, as you can imagine. There was cheering and roses thrown up on stage and all that. Typical stuff. And then the next year, the organizers reached out to me and they said, hey, that session went really well. This cloud thing's really getting some attention. Would you be interested in doing that cloud session, that's your PowerShell session, but on the cloud, using PowerShell with SharePoint Online? I'm like, absolutely. For a trip to Australia and New Zealand, absolutely, I will. So I agreed to it and wrote up everything. And then I loaded up the version of that module that we talked about back then, and it had 32 commandlets in it. So by way of comparison, at that point, SharePoint Server had 600-700, something like that, and the online one had 32, and that's including like the one where you connect and the one where you disconnect, and it was pretty basic back then.
I think the engineering team referred to it as PowerShell on rails. They didn't realize that they forgot to give you any cars to put on the rail.
There was nothing there. I figured it out, but I started that session by, we're just talking about this module. It's got 32 commandlets, so we're going to spend 2 minutes on each one, a little introduction, conclusion, all that. But now it's got hundreds, and it's pretty well usable. I have a slide in my old decks that said, the module name, and then here's what it's used for, and then the next slide is blank. Here's all the great things you can do with it, and there's nothing there. That's not the case anymore. I'd take that slide out. But so we talked about like the Viva Connection stuff and the hubs and all that. That is where those things showed up. And for SharePoint administrators, so not like content owners or site owners or anything like that, but for SharePoint administrators, that is kind of the first step in using PowerShell. You can get connected to your SharePoint tenant, you can create sites, you can delete sites, rename sites, that kind of thing, set up hub sites, join hub sites, but nothing smaller than the site level really inside that module. But it's good for just basic tenant maintenance. And the other thing to keep in mind is because of this great module framework that PowerShell has, anybody can write them. I can write them. Mark can't write them, but anybody can write these. So it's important to know like which ones come from Microsoft and which ones come from the product team. And that one that we talked about, the SharePoint one that I won't make Mark say it again because we've got time constraints. That one is the one, the official one from the SharePoint product team. And every product team is responsible for their own module. So that one only does SharePoint. There's an Exchange one that only does Exchange. There's a Teams one that only does Exchange or Teams. But that's what that is. That's the official one. We'll talk about some other ones later on, but that's the official one.
We know the SharePoint Online Management Shell started off a little thin, and it grew over the years. So going from tens to hundreds is really good. And certainly to know that you're managing your instance of the cloud from a SharePoint perspective. But we know that you, as a consultant at Sympraxis, and for a lot of people out there needing to do a lot more complex actions, possibly involving, reaching out to other systems or services. Can you tell us about some of the work that you contribute to, and if anything, even to expound a little bit on just the general nature of the PnP side of PowerShell, PnP being a patterns and practices offering that Microsoft and a lot of MVPs and community members contribute to and make awesome in so many ways. But just give us that little, when you want more power, not just PowerShell, but more power out of PowerShell, bring in the PnP. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the PnP was a revolutionary thing, and I feel bad that I don't remember where I was when I first heard about it, because it's definitely one of those things I should have. But the PnP in general, like you said, is the patterns and practices, and it was a thing that Microsoft started doing a few years ago to give developers rails for how to write things for SharePoint, because I used to have a shtick where I would make fun of developers a lot, but the more I get known for doing PowerShell, the tougher that shtick is to sell. So I'm going to have to.
I've seen you still do it. I don't think developers are safe yet around you.
But anyway, so back in the day, developers did some truly unholy things to SharePoint, and so Microsoft said, "Okay, we got to give these guys some idea how to do this." So they come up with patterns and practices, and it was patterns and practices on how to write web parts and how to write features and all these kind of things. And one of them was how to write a PowerShell function that accessed SharePoint. And they created a few commandlets that showed how to write them, and then showed what. But the thing is, some people downloaded those and went, "Wow, this is really handy," and they started using the PnP PowerShell as a tool, not as a guide. So it was people like me that started doing it. So then some people started writing some other commandlets, and before we know it, it is like the premier PowerShell module for managing SharePoint. And up until a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I forget exactly when it happened, there was a version for on-prem SharePoint, so 2013, 2016, and the like, and then a version for SharePoint Online. And so what that did, number one, it removed Microsoft kind of from the equation, which was good, because that way we didn't have the bottleneck of Microsoft. People having to do their day jobs and find time to do that, because anybody can contribute it. But also you can do some things that you wouldn't necessarily, Microsoft wouldn't necessarily want you to do. You have a little more freedom. And so now these commandlets, I mentioned before that the official module didn't manage anything smaller than a site. Now the PnP, they could do anything. So now you can manage anything down to the individual item, list items and properties on list items and things like that. And so that really opened the door, because before the PnP PowerShell, if you wanted to do something to a web or to a document library or something, you had to write CSOM, the command side object model. And you could write a PowerShell commandlet that used CSOM to do a thing. And that was really ugly. And so what that meant was, for folks like me, I was at the mercy again of those darn developers to show me what the CSOM was, so I could write the PowerShell to use the CSOM. And CSOM wasn't really meant to do that, so it was kind of painful. And there were no protections in place. I could write bad CSOM PowerShell and do some bad things. So the PnP really opened up the door for some of this really great work, really great automation in using PowerShell. And now it's really become the tier one. We've mentioned that Microsoft module a couple of times. Honestly, I never use it. Everything that the SharePoint module can do, the Microsoft SharePoint module can do, the PnP can do. And for new things like Viva Topics and all of that, I don't know if the PnP can do it now, but when that first hit, when Viva Topic first came out, I went out to see it. Obviously, the Microsoft team was ready for it, so the current module then handled it. So I set Viva Topics up with the Microsoft module. You only have to do that once. So I did it, and I've not checked to see when the PnP added that, but I'm sure it's in there. But for the most part, everything that the Microsoft module does, the PnP one does. And, the Microsoft one comes out whenever new functionality needs to be added. And then as soon as that comes out, somebody on the PnP team reverse engineers the commandlets, adds them to the PnP. So it's, usually the next rev that they're.
So what you're saying is the PnP PowerShell basically continuously sings the song, anything you can do, I can do better. Anything you can do, I can do. So I'm going to start us off with tips and tricks, going off of that light joke reference, but to the reality of what you just stated. There's a ton of value in people learning from, or just like you said, using the PnP examples and contributing if they're open to it. So that's the first tip as a marketer. I'm going to put a link in the show notes and the blog that just points directly to where to get started with the PnP PowerShell. I think it's a great reference point, but also something you should go back to. And again, if you want to contribute to it, there's a great way to do that. That's my one tip. I want to get from you, if in the year 2022 of any tool or any action or anything that people, before they pull out their hair because they've done it for the 15th time in a really challenging way, what from a PowerShell perspective is one or two tips or tricks that you would present to somebody? Maybe this is what you present at the end of your sessions, but what would you say is a one or two tip or trick for 2022 PowerShell, Todd?
Yeah, so I will answer that in a second. I wanted to add to your tip. I think adding, so going to the PnP, consuming it, yes, that's great. You mentioned contributing back. That's even better. But it's easy for folks, especially folks like myself who aren't developers. It's easy for us to talk ourselves out of contributing because I can't write code. I can't write C# code that gets compiled into PowerShell commands. I don't have the ability to do that. But what my tip, 1A would be, everybody has something to contribute. So what I have contributed is examples. So there's been a bunch of times where I've found the PnP PowerShell commandlet that did exactly what I wanted, but the examples that were there weren't exactly what I needed. But it seemed like something somebody else would want. So I've packaged that up and I've added that example to the repo. So then the next time that module gets built, that extra example's in there. I didn't have to know how to code. All I had to do was just show them another way to use that. Because there's nothing new under the sun. So somebody else has been trying to do the thing that I was doing. So no matter what your level is, you can contribute by helping with documentation, examples, whatever. Everybody's got something to offer. I would encourage people to do that.
All right. So tip number one, go get, contribute, read, be reassured that anybody who knows anything can be of value and an asset. Tip two.
Yeah. Tip two, I would say I'd also like to build on that one. The PnP has a sample gallery. So you can go to the PnP sample gallery and you can, up at the top there's a by tool, and you can click that by tool, and then the PnP PowerShell is one of the tools there. One of the great things, so you mentioned, trying to find a way to do something and all that. There's a good chance that somebody has already done the thing that you're trying to do or something very similar. And so if you go to that sample gallery, that will potentially get you 80% of the way towards whatever the thing is you're trying to do. And you can search in there, so you can search site or list or whatever. It'll start sorting things out there. So I really like that sample gallery, and that's another place you can contribute too. If you have something that's a little more complicated than just an example, you've got some process that you want to show off. That sample gallery, Paul Bullock maintains that he would love to have your sample in there. But definitely don't reinvent the wheel, especially if you're new to PowerShell. I know so I've been doing this PowerShell thing for 13 years, something like that. Nearly everything that I do starts with me trying to see if somebody else has done it before, and then I steal the relevant bits and add my own. And that's, yeah.
So if we can get one more number 3 out of you, and if I can ask for it to be something that is just a really tactical, actionable thing that a SharePoint tenant admin, that you would just say, just do it like this, or just take this action. What's that one thing that people should just stop doing X and do Y? Yeah,
so we'll see if this one meets. I see where you're going. I think my tip for that would be to get a developer tenant. And so for folks that aren't familiar with it, Microsoft very graciously gives developers a free Microsoft 365 tenant. And that tenant has a bunch of users and a bunch of content and all of that. I say that as a PowerShell tip because I can promise you that when you're practicing PowerShell, you're not going to get it right the first time. And if you make a mistake in a dev tenant, you won't get fired. And so the thing that I love about the dev tenants is it just gives you the ability to do anything. You have complete freedom to try anything that you find on my blog or find, in the sample gallery. You just have this clean slate that you can do whatever with. I never test anything in production. I'm writing this thing for a customer now. I built their tenant. I built every tool in their tenant. I know their tenant better than they do. I'm writing this tool for them. I'm testing it in my dev tenant because that's where I just feel free. I just have no concerns. I feel free to try whatever because I can't break anything. I've got a blog post on that. Julie Turner's got a blog post on that. You can put something in the notes. I can get that to you. That's the first thing I tell folks. Get a dev tenant and then just feel free to try anything.
I would just amplify that and kind of pivoting back into your last comment. Just to reiterate, PowerShell now has all of these rules around code signing and do you trust the source of something? So as you're experimenting, you can find some really nasty PowerShells out there that are intended to infect your system and do all sorts of bad things. So you have to having a safe sandbox to play around with stuff is important, because if you open up those PowerShells, it's really hard to look at it and tell exactly what it's doing because they're so abstracted and messed up. So that's a great point in the dev environments.
And I will make an offer to anybody for the Internet Podcast listening audience. If anybody finds a PowerShell script and they're new or not, and they just don't know if it's safe to run, they can reach out to me on Twitter, email, whatever, and I will give them my appraisal on whether I think it's a good one or not. Because you're absolutely right. You should be able to break it open and understand what it's doing. But when you're starting out, you can't always do that. So get the dev tenant. I think that's a good one.
That is probably the safest, best advice, because, once people start monkeying around with whatever they need or want to do with SharePoint Monkey or not, they will be able to decide what that action is that they want to try out and do it in a safe way. So I think it's a great one. It's exactly what we were looking for.
Yeah, and I've got a great blog post. When back in the day, SharePoint on-prem days, I was trying to figure out a way to do some stuff with the config database. I won't bore your audience with the whole story, but I wrote some PowerShell and I mixed up what the equal sign does. And instead of looking for the database named SharePoint, instead of looping through all my databases and looking for the database whose name was SharePoint config, I looped through all of my databases in my farm and renamed every database to SharePoint config. My SharePoint farm was not a fan of that. It did not. It took it well, but not as well as it could have. But the good news is I was in a test environment, and I'd been doing PowerShell for years at that point. I should have known better, but I just didn't. Fortunately, it was a VM. I could roll it back. But no matter where you're at in the maturity model, you're going to make mistakes. So that dev tenant's safe bet.
Todd, I know that's a great suggestion, and we will post a link to where to go get a dev tenant into the show notes.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we not only thank you for your time, but thank you for giving the audience a way to use PowerShell to order new cars, to manage SharePoint, to maybe infiltrate your blog if they know the right script to wrap back around to the year 2010, but that it's extended the support of SharePoint 2010 for you. I think that's a testament to PowerShell on its own. So not only are we glad that you can get SP Site whenever you want to, but I was really glad that we could get Todd Klindt. So thank you for being on the Intro Zone.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Anytime. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Up next on the Intro Zone, it's time for events. If there's an event going on in our community, we love to talk about it, tell you what's upcoming, and promote it here on the Intro Zone. Mark, what's coming up?
If we went back a day, was Microsoft Inspire 2022. And I'm saying it now as something that's important because everything's now on demand. And there was a really large amount of news that came across the company, from Azure announcements to Power Platform, and of course, closer to our home, Microsoft Viva. And again, this event was July 19th through the 20th. But if you go to the Inspire site, find whatever it is you're looking for, you will see it on demand. You will be able to soak up all the goodness. But Chris, since you work and breathe and live in Microsoft Viva land, what were some of the things that we can at least highlight that were announced at Inspire?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the lead things is the availability of Viva Engage, which is derived from what we've been doing with Yammer over the past decade, to be able to bring Engage in to drive those conversations across all of your employee experiences. We also announced the upcoming general availability of Viva Goals, looking at objectives and key results and how you fit those in for your employees. Update on Viva Sales, which helps you bring information from other systems into the flow of work inside of places like Outlook and Teams, so you don't have to jump to a different application to look up a contact or enter an opportunity detail. And new APIs across Viva Learning, being able to help you code the way that you're going to inject other learning content into the Viva suite. And one of the lovely things about Inspire is as we virtualized it, we are able to bring people in free of charge because it's done from the comfort of home. So we're able to broaden the content, and it's still a partner-focused event. However, it's a great place to land capabilities across modern work and beyond. So plenty of new announcements on support for hybrid meetings and team, being able to optimize recordings from Teams meetings into video with chapters and tons more, and you can follow along in our blogs. Mark, that's here in July. There's another event coming up. For some reason, I think you and I are doing something at it. Do I have that correctly?
We are. You and I, from an in-person perspective, are going to be in Dallas, Texas, August 8th through the 12th for 365 EduCon Dallas. And what Chris is hinting at is that he and I have a co-presented keynote, and I hope we have a little bit of the Interzone fun during the keynote to help kick things off. And then, of course, spend time engaging, answering questions. And I think, Chris, you even have a breakout session that we're planning. And I can't quite say yet who, but there might be a third person from one of our customers joining us on stage. So that's 365 EduCon in Dallas, August 8th through the 12th, 2022.
And the average temperature in Dallas in the month of August is 97 degrees. So let's hope it's air conditioned.
There's a lot of water, there's a lot of AC, and all the coolness will keep us cool.
Beyond that, when we pivot into the slightly cooler months of the autumn, HR Tech, which is our first foray to HR Tech as a live event, that's coming up September 13th to 16th. It is in Las Vegas, I believe at the Mandalay Bay. It is a great place for us to unpack and let people put their hands on some of the latest capabilities that we've brought forth for Viva.
Yeah, and shortly after HR Tech in September as well, September 20th through the 22nd, skipping from the Mandalay Bay, Vegas area over to Orlando, is the Microsoft Power Platform Conference. This is the first ever based in the US Power Platform Conference. It's co-sponsored with Microsoft. Got a lot of headliner keynotes from Charles Lamanna, Jeff Teeper, Heather Newman, and also Scott Hanselman will be there. Of course, there's a lot of breakout sessions and workshops from Microsoft, from the community, from Microsoft MVPs. It's going to be a great show. If you want to learn anything about Power Platform, the Power Platform Conference, September 20th to the 22nd.
Just a few days behind that, the European Cloud Summit, which brings multiple cloud platform providers together with speakers, leaders, customers, delegates. That's running September 26th to 28th at Mainz in Germany.
And to round off the last event that we have that is also in September is another 365 EduCon in Chicago. This is September 26th through the 30th. And unique about this, there will be two keynotes, one that's focused on Microsoft 365 All Up, and one that's focused on the Power Platform. There's a number of people coming from Microsoft, of course, a lot of community and Microsoft MVPs as well, focused on the Chicago land and everything that is in between. If you are in the Chicago area, don't miss 365 EduCon Chicago, September 26th through the 30th.
And that's as far as we've gone so far. Of course, if you have an event happening close to you or anywhere and you'd like to feature it on a future episode of the Interzone, please write to us and we'd love to put the spotlight there. Thank you.
We want to thank our guest, Todd Klindt, Mr. PowerShell, for being on the show and for giving us insights about the power of PowerShell then and now.
We encourage you to check out our show page for links to everything we talked about today and more. Visit us at aka.ms/theinterzone.
Send us your questions and feedback. For the SharePoint teams, you can reach us via email at theinterzone@microsoft.com or via Twitter @SharePoint, @mcashman, and @cmcnulty2000.
Is it via or via?
Via, it's a potato. It's a patata. You just, it's getting hot. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Fair enough. You say tomato, I say potato. Remember to rate, review, and tell all your friends about the show. Follow the show at the local home run derby or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Thank you for listening, and thank you, Chris, for letting me know that it's now a 14-game winning streak. Go Mariners! We are your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty. This has been The Interzone, a show about the Microsoft 365 automated commandlets intelligent intranet.